What's up guys, welcome back to the channel. My name is Jake and I give weekly product design tutorials and design related content. Today's video, I want to share my process for approaching a dark UI theme. So recently on a project, I was in charge of building out the entire design system for this dark themed UI. And I've learned a lot along the way. This is kind of the first time I've actually had to do this at scale. I had done a lot of dark UI kind of as visual explorations, for portfolios or just for fun. But as far as actually building out an entire scalable design system, this was new to me. So I've learned a lot. Hopefully I have some nuggets of information that you guys will take some value from. And without further ado, let's get into the video.
So usually the first thing I'll do before starting any type of UI design project is I'll search for some inspiration. And I used to have almost too much pride to do this because as designers, we pride ourselves in being creatives and we want to basically do everything from scratch. But the more I've worked in the industry and been on these really tight deadlines, I've realized we don't really have that much time to recreate the wheel always, as much as we'd like to. So it's always good to get a sense of best practices and like what other top designers are doing. So for this project in particular, we actually pitched the client two separate visual directions. One was more of a lighter theme and one was a darker theme. So we basically pitched them some really flashy home pages, and the client really liked the visual direction of the darker theme. They thought that was more in line with their future vision of their brand. But it's one thing to have these really flashy home pages. It's another thing to kind of carry this theme out through all of the interior pages of this product that we were delivering. So we wanted to make sure, this dark theme could scale. But at any rate, the first thing I did was I went to, I think it was Dribbble initially, or, I use Pinterest a lot too, because you can create mood boards really easily that way. But just to get a sense of what other designers are doing and check out some like best practices, I guess, for a dark UI. So let's do a search for dark UI. And it's just like at a very high level, let's try to get a sense of, what other designers are doing. So here's what looks like an analytics dashboard by, I hope I'm not butchering this name, but Kostia Varhatiuk. Looks like some really nice work here. But just kind of notice what this designer has done. So I'm noticing these containers down here. There's actually very low contrast with these containers against the darker background. Whereas these containers have a bit higher contrast, and just visually it looks like these are a bit closer to us just because of the use of color. Notice the background is not a black, right? Dark theme, we think like black usually, or maybe like a very dark gray, but this designer kind of opted for more of that blue undertone that kind of sets the tone for everything else. Again, like these containers, very low contrast, and then stuff they want to highlight, they're using a bit more color. The palette itself, it's pretty sparse. It's, only a few different colors. It's more of a, what do they call it? Like a monochromatic color scheme, right? Where it's just more or less hues of blue. And then, for these values here, we have the green and red. So not too many colors. The text really pops against the darker background. I think accessibility wise, this is looking pretty good. There's some of these numbers that are, I guess, of lesser visual importance intentionally that might not pass the AA or AAA accessibility standard, but overall, like, this is looking pretty solid. Let's check out another darker theme. Let's see, something that catches my eye. This is pretty cool. So I've seen this one before. Oh, it's the same designer. Wow, this designer is pretty awesome. Shout out Kostia. But can we make this full screen? So this looks like it's some sort of server UI. So it's like a geolocation UI basically of all the servers, and here's like a little key down here. Again though, it's not a complete black background, right? Although there is some sort of radial gradation going on here. And then this looks like, this container they wanted to separate a bit. And again, the text is looking really bold against this really dark background. Good use of color here. I like the blue shades here. Let's just try to find one more example. I'm kind of looking for more of just like a standard, analytics type dashboard here. This will be a good example by Alexei Savitsky. So again, look at these containers against the darker background, right? It's very low contrast. And one of the mistakes, when you guys send me your work to kind of review and critique, some of the designs you guys send me, you guys are making these containers stand out on these darker UIs. And that's not really the point. The point is for these dark UIs to emit very low light. They can be used at nighttime really easily. And the colors really pop out against the dark. There's a lot of contrast between the color and the text. So if you were to make these containers, too much into the lighter colors, these accent colors and these numbers would not pop out as much. So yeah, these are some great examples. One other thing that you guys should definitely do, I think, when designing dark theme UIs is head over to like a material design or some other like industry, leader. This is Google's material design. They kind of set the standard for a lot of our responsive web products these days. They did a lot of research, basically having these digital products mimic the real world. One thing that I looked at in particular is their take on a dark theme and kind of their approach. And there's some great stuff in here. They have like their core principles, basically darken with gray rather than a pure black to express elevation, color with accents. Again, like these dark themes conserve energy, so you don't want to use a lot of color. And accessibility is a huge one. It's actually, I noticed on this project, accessibility was a bit of a pain trying to get everything to meet the AAA standard that our client wanted. But one thing that I want to show you that I think is really important, if I can find it. Yeah, so this is what I was talking about with elevation. So notice on the left here, you have a lighter theme and how elevation would be expressed, right? So we have a white against a white. So we have a white container against a white background. And this container color is not changing. The only thing that's changing here is the shadow to kind of create that perception of depth. Where on the right, we have the same shadow principles, but the color of this container is actually changing. It's becoming a lighter shade of gray to create that perception that this container is closer to us. So the idea here is that there would be a light source kind of shining down from above. So if you would imagine as this container gets closer to that light source, it becomes lighter and lighter. So this product is, in a sense, mimicking real world conditions here. And they go into how to create these elevation principles. So what's happening here is you basically start with a very dark color. I think they recommend the hex code 121212 to start with as your background color. And then to create these different levels of elevation, what you're doing is you're adding a white overlay with a certain level of opacity against that dark background and then sampling that color. So that's like your level 1, this is your level 2, this is your level 3, et cetera, et cetera. And as you increase in elevation, you'll notice that this overlay is becoming a lighter and lighter gray. And this is going to make more sense when I show you my file. So I'm going to link this below as well as some other good resources that you guys can check out for dark UIs, but this would be a great place to start to kind of get in the right mindset and to really start thinking about how this dark theme will scale, right? It's one thing to, create a very flashy, one flashy page, right? But you got to start thinking about how is this going to scale across an entire product? Like what if throughout a product, what if there are more levels of elevation than just this? How are we going to systematize that? How are we going to componentize that in Sketch or whatever design tool we're using? So for this tutorial, I actually whipped up something for you guys in Figma. Fun fact, I'm starting to use Figma a lot more. That last Sketch update really kind of was the last straw for me. I don't know what they were thinking in terms of their layer styles and text styles and how they're handling it with that folder system, but it just was not intuitive for me. And I've also just been wanting to dive into Figma anyway. And in the agency context, I think it just makes so much more sense because we constantly have designers just sending sketch files back and forth. And, Figma allows us to collaborate in the same file. There's only like one source of truth, which is really awesome. Even though we use Sketch and Abstract, but I'm rambling now. But anyway, here's the wireframe I cooked up for you guys. I know it looks really shitty, but again, this is a very low fidelity concept here. I was just trying to get the point across. Basically, it's a location-based UI, so we'd have a map area, as I so nicely denoted here, map area. I didn't want to actually, design the map because I was going to use an external tool to do this anyway, so I'll show you that in a second. But essentially, we have a location, so say this was New York City, and you could filter by a certain category. Certain points of interest in that city. So maybe, in this case, it's restaurants. So maybe we filter by restaurants. And then on the map, we have some location markers that pop up. We have some map controls here, some more filter and search options here. We have a left nav bar. I didn't really put too much thought into the UX of all this and what these icons actually will mean. This is more just a demo to show you how I handle this visually. But then say we hover over one of these location markers, we get some more information about that location with this right rail here. So we have some general information, phone number, email, address, website, and then maybe like customer reviews, like what other people are saying about this. So I'm sure you guys have seen a similar interface, maybe on like Google Maps or some other geolocation based UIs. So here's what I started with, but even at this low fidelity stage, I started thinking about how my palette was gonna work. So I'm not actually deciding like which colors I'm using, but I wanted to at least address the visual hierarchy as much as I could. So before we were talking about how elevation plays a role in these dark UIs, and I wanted to at least nail that somewhat at this point. So just visually looking at this, right? I want this map layer to appear the darkest, which in turn will make it feel the furthest away from our user, assuming that there's a light source shining down from above. So this would be like the darkest area, and then these containers, so like this right rail and the left nav, they're about the same level of elevation as denoted by the same color here, same shade of gray in this case. And then like these cards that sit on top of this container will be a lighter shade of gray, which will in turn make that appear a little closer to us. And then these containers within the card, and like this guy sits on top of those containers. So I'm playing with the elevation here, and then like this tooltip is like the lightest shade of gray. So off the bat, I'm thinking maybe that's the closest to us, right? Maybe you want to create the feeling that this is the most, most important thing on the page. And then like these guys are about the same level of elevation as these cards here. So we're already kind of creating some depth in this dark UI, even at this low fidelity stage. And then I took this wire, and let's just bring this down here. I took this wireframe and created a visual comp, basically. So I created a fictional brand here with this like two-tone purple here, just to kind of set the tone for the palette that I was using. And like just by comparing this with the wireframe, you can see that this map layer here appears the darkest, and then like this container is feeling a little lighter and a little closer to us just because of those shades of this underlying purple. And I'm gonna get into how I created this map in a second. I did not design this myself, but this basically I wanted to first establish my base color, right? Because that's what everything else is sort of playing off of. So like all of these containers are sort of derivatives of this background color. So to get this initial background color, what Google recommends in their material design guidelines for dark UIs is you start with a color of 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. So this is a very dark gray. And then what they recommend you do to make this more of a branded color rather than just a cookie cutter material design theme is you take another color, you put it right on top of that 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. And then you sample your main brand color. So this is like my primary brand purple right here. And then you basically drop the opacity of this to somewhere around 8%. You can kind of play with this, see what looks good. But now you have a slightly more purple background color. And then what you would do is you would just sample this color. So now this 181621 would be your initial background color, which kind of sets the tone for all of these other elements, like all of these other containers. So that's what I did here for this background color. Now to get the colors of all of these other elements, right? Like so the color scheme of this map and these containers, I did another thing that Google recommends you do is you literally just take a white square. So let's make this white, and you put it over that, themed background color that you made, and you just drop the alpha value to create your different levels of elevation. So if I just bring up my little sticker sheet here, I wouldn't call this a design system yet, but basically I decided that this next level up, so this L1 on top of the L0 would be a white square at 4% opacity. So let's just drop this to 4. And then you just sample this color, and that would sort of be your next level up. So that's like this guy right here. And this should match with this L1 here. So that's how I got that next level of elevation to start creating that depth. And because it's a white square at a certain alpha value, you're getting those undertones of that background layer, of that background purple. So that background layer is really setting the tone for everything else. And that's really how I built this palette. So I did the same thing for L2, right? So this time it was a white square at 6% opacity, pure white. So let's draw out, make this white, make the alpha value 6. And that's how I got this. All right, let me sample it first. And that's how I got this next level up, this L2, etc., etc. Now, this map itself, I did not vectorize this myself. That would obviously take forever. I actually use a tool called Mapbox that you're looking at here. And I didn't really take too much time to consider what the user might actually need to see in terms of like labeling. I made this really simple just for this tutorial's sake, but you can actually style the different elements of the map. So this background layer, I just made the same color as my L0. Then this next level up, I would make my L1. And then this guy, like these buildings, I made that L2. So that's how I made that. I basically just took a screenshot of this and pasted it right in here. And then these guys, like this container and this container, are that L3 value. So that would be like a 9%. And these are sort of arbitrary. There was no rhyme or reason to these values I chose. Google's a little more mathematical about their approach, but I just kind of went by feel and what looked right and then documented them here. So that's sort of how I established this like purple scale here for these containers. And it's all derived basically from this primary color on top of that Google 121212 recommended background color. So you got a really consistent visual feel here just by using these white overlays and these different shades of that purple. So that's one key part of it. So the next key part with these dark themes is to make sure all of your text is readable and you are hitting all of your accessibility requirements. So for example, the client I'm currently on, they really were pushing for AAA accessibility. So we wanted to make sure we met all of those. One thing you'll notice is I do have some very high contrast text here. So we have the pure white text against the container that it's sitting on, and we have some lower contrast text. And I did this almost intentionally because I wanted to make the email address more important than the title email. I want the phone number to be more important than this guy here. So this is the hierarchy I kind of intentionally chose. I intentionally made this lower contrast. And as you can see here in my naming, I didn't name this a pure white. I named it a high contrast. And I didn't name this guy, a gray. I just named it low contrast because, ultimately, if I wanted to also create a light theme for this, we would have a high contrast for the light theme as well as a high contrast for the dark theme. So notice for here, my naming convention was high contrast / dark rather than just, naming this white, because if I wanted to, add a high contrast color in a light theme, this would probably be a darker gray. So I would just name it a high contrast light. I tried to avoid just naming these based on their color. I really was thinking about, the use case for these colors. So that's a little aside note. But then actually testing these values, right? So we want to make sure that all of these are passing any accessibility, standards that we need to hit. So what I use is a tool called Stark. It's actually a Figma plugin, and I think there's a Sketch plugin as well. You can select the text layer as well as the layer that it's sitting on top of. And I just come over to Plugins, Stark, check Contrast, and a little contrast checker pops up. And as you see, we're hitting all of our AA and AAA accessibility requirements for both normal and large text. So this would pass. Now we can check that lower contrast against the container. So let's see how this sits. Stark, check contrast. So this one does not meet that AAA of 7:1 ratio, 7:1 contrast ratio, but we are hitting AA. And this one, I don't think it's as important that it's hitting AAA because I am intentionally making this a lower contrast. It's also clear that this is an email address because it literally says dimsumgarden@gmail.com. And since that one passes AAA, I don't think you additionally need the title to show that this is an email address. Same thing with the phone number, right? Like we're listing a phone number right here, as well as the address. The text shown is clearly an address. So since those all pass AAA, I don't think it's as important that the titles of these read-only form fields pass AAA. So these are just things that you should be aware of. You might, by law be required to make this one meet AAA, in which case you would have to probably make this just a lighter shade of gray or closer to this white to make sure it's hitting AAA. So basically you would want to check the contrast of all of your text against all of their containers. So here's another one we can check. Select these two layers. And this one actually is hitting all of our accessibility requirements. So overall, from an accessibility, readability perspective, we're looking pretty good here. One other thing I didn't really touch on is you'll notice that there isn't that much going on here in terms of color, but it still feels kind of cohesive and tied to the brand. Again, dark themes, you don't want to emit a lot of light. That's kind of the point of them. And we're using that accent color sparingly throughout. So I chose to use it for these little location markers. So I basically just took this accent color, made a little component here, which is comprised of an inner circle, then a circle with a background blur, pretty high blur, then an outer or another concentric circle, and then that outer circle. So that's the component there. And these are actually all the same component. I'm just hiding some layers of that component on certain on these different markers, just because I wanted to create some hierarchy. So like this would be like the selected state, right? Or like the hover state. And maybe I'm showing that these are actually animating or pulsing. But yeah, it's only one component that I'm using, and that's something I try to do. I'm trying to use as little symbols and components as possible when creating design systems. And basically all this documentation you see here on the right is all just from this screen, but we probably have enough now documented in terms of, palette and elevation and textiles and components to go ahead and scale this thing and start building out other screens. And we would just kind of follow these elevation principles and our palette principles and, use some of these textiles. Of course, this will continue to grow and evolve as we build out this design system. But yeah, hopefully this gives you an idea of, not only how to go from this wired out stage to a more high fidelity stage, but also start documenting some of your styles so that you're able to scale this thing. So yeah, I think that's it for now. Hope you guys enjoyed this video and learned something. Hopefully this gives you some perspective on how to approach darker themed UIs. They're becoming very popular nowadays. I'm sure you guys have noticed, like even in iOS, that new update, it's now like a system thing that people are choosing to go fully dark. Same with Mac, like you have a lot of these light to dark toggles. They're pretty much everywhere, and a lot of companies are kind of expecting to have both a light and dark theme for their UI. So any aspiring UI designers, you should be prepared to, start building scalable design systems that come in different themes, both light and dark, and maybe some alternative theming as well. So hopefully this is a good starting point for you guys. And if you guys enjoyed this video, I'd really appreciate a thumbs up. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll talk to you guys in the next one.